Let me tell you about a few things that are in Homestuck. A war between sentient chess people, 3 apocalyptic Earths, an alien world where the Pope is a juggalo, eldritch beings that select a young girl as their avatar, multiple characters claiming to be the true narrator, and this? That was Robo Bunny Liv Tyler dying heroically within the green sun, set to a musician high on paint fumes covering Aerosmith's I Don't Want to Miss a Thing. On YouTube, you'll find dozens of video essays and dissertations that analyze this odd little aspect of internet history and culture, known as Homestuck, with the affectation of a disassociated or mid professor giving an anthropology lesson about some strange other. Sometimes they'll claim to have been fans themselves, which is meant to give them credibility for their criticisms as a member of the in-group. Yet, if I try to defend against these criticisms as a self-admitted fan, I am accused of bias. This is interesting to me, as it should be seen as bias either way, no? If we are to give a negative review of Homestuck credit for the creator having a history with the subject, could we not say a positive review of Homestuck equally deserves that credit given the same history? Perhaps the perceived value comes from a faux neutrality. Of course a fan of Homestuck would love it, and an outsider would think less positively of it. It's only if a fan thought negatively, or an outsider thought positively, would the scales be weighed. Obviously, this is ridiculous. A bias in favor, against, or in a detached news media style are all biases regardless. You cannot escape bias, only acknowledge it. I say this to indicate why I'm making this video, and to state my biases up front. Homestuck changed my life. It's genuinely a good piece of art that often goes overlooked by people wishing to drag its legacy through the mud. It's not perfect by any means, and believe me, I will get to criticisms in due time. But I decided I could not just sit by and let history be revised. So, here I am. I know not how many people this video will ever reach, but my goal is to at least get people to understand why Homestuck captured the imaginations of so many people, myself included. This video is for all the Zoomers to Boomers who missed out on this experience, who felt unsatisfied with the prevailing narrative. And to any fellow Homestucks watching, I warn you to brace yourself for some hot takes, but my heart goes out to you nonetheless. What the f is Homestuck? Homestuck is a story about some kids on the internet that play a video game together that heralds the end of the world, where they must seek to find meaning in the nonsensical greater landscape of the universe away from the comfort of what they had thought to be home. However, in the real world, Homestuck is a media property originally created by Andrew Hussey on their website MS-Paint Adventures, later incorporated into What Pumpkin Games, which was eventually bought by the corporation Viz Media. But the term Homestuck usually refers to the webcomic of the same name that started it all. Homestuck began on April 13th, 2009, and it would soon become a genuine marvel. Webcomics like it existed prior, but Homestuck managed to hook an audience that appreciated how it blended the interactivity of video game mechanics, both in function and in the narrative, into a serial webcomic format. The core content were just images, but frequently included walls of text, dialogue, and narration. Accompanying the static content were flash animations, musical compositions, and even the occasional interactive game. The dialogue was predominantly written in the form of online chat logs via instant messenger, furthering the feeling that this was a story in, about, and around the medium of the internet. Originally, readers could even input suggestions for the characters and plot, though this was phased out after Homestuck reached a certain level of popularity. This interactivity is plastered all over early Homestuck, though it never truly goes away, as throughout the first acts of Homestuck is a user interface of one of the fictional systems, from the Sylladex to the Strife Specify to the Spurb interface. Much of the early story focuses on hijinks that ensue from both the characters and the readers learning how the systems even function, much like how most kids play video games without reading the instruction manuals. I believe this interactivity can partially explain why Homestuck's fandom grew quickly and passionately, as it was easier for people to become invested in it compared to other comics where you just watched from the sidelines or left comments. Early on, Homestuck's dalliance in video games resulted in an indulgence with programming humor, which I personally found to still be amusing, even with no knowledge of programming at the time, but it's often surprising to many based on the behemoth that it would later become. The Flash animations would later become the highlight of the series, as typically each animation would signify a climax with revelations and twists in the story. It is a shame, though, that Flash is now a dated technology, born mostly out of cybersecurity concerns, which unfortunately means that much of the original Homestuck web pages don't play reliably. Fortunately, some archivists have managed to salvage Homestuck, so risk of story segments disappearing altogether have been avoided at least thus far. An often underappreciated aspect of Homestuck is that of its music. You know Toby Fox, right? The Undertale guy? Well, guess where Megalovania was used before Sans? That's right. In fact, Toby Fox had a hand in the majority of the albums for Homestuck, aided by scores of other talented artists, amassing an entire library of Homestuck music that appeared in both official and unofficial content for over a decade. But let's stop talking technical details and get to the juicy part. The story, that sweet, enormous story. The recap. Homestuck is long. It was once compared by Mike Rignetta of PBS Idea Channel to the tome Ulysses, and that was before it had even been finished. But a lot of video essays do recaps of the media they analyze before they get to the meat of the analysis. You'll never see this with Homestuck, which is disappointing. Part of it is probably because there's no incentive to go into detail about the actual story when you just want to trash Homestuck, but also it's probably because of just how big Homestuck is. Either way, I'm up for the challenge. Let's do this, let's make this happen. I'm going to recap the entire plot of Homestuck to set the groundwork for analysis. Now let's get started. Okay, it turned out that the recap was so long it took up like half the script, so I've spun that out into its own video and I'll put a link in the description when it's out. Check it out and come back here if you want, but no shame in skipping it and just pressing on. As you can probably tell by the video title, I'm a fan of Homestuck, but the sequel never got a proper ending. I'll talk about why, but first I want to talk about the comic itself, along with the spin-offs that were made along the way to help further contextualize later analysis. Spin-offs. It's relevant to note that Homestuck was just the latest in a series of comics that Hussie made on the MS Paint Adventures website, or MSPA, named after the art style which emulated the look of drawing with the limited tools in the original Microsoft Paint. Seriously, old Paint and modern Paint are not the same. Notably, the comics also featured reader suggestions, allowing the readers to directly influence the story. The first was Jailbreak, a silly story about a prisoner trying to escape a jail. The second was Bard Quest, featuring a fantasy bard trying to slay a dragon. The third was Problem Sleuth, a complicated tale about some detectives on a dangerous quest to defeat the evil that prevents them from leaving their building. Each of these stories increases in complexity, and you can see that Problem Sleuth is in many ways a precursor to what Homestuck will become. Several characters from Problem Sleuth reappear in Homestuck, and Homestuck even makes a joke about how, in the post-Scratch timeline, Hussie did what many fans may have originally asked, making Problem Sleuth 2 instead of moving on to a new project. Problem Sleuth 2 isn't real, but it makes the point that by choosing not to move on to another project, in that timeline, Homestuck doesn't exist there. The first Homestuck-related game was a dating sim crossover between Namco and Homestuck called Namco High. You can play as a cousin from Katamari and can date many obscure Namco characters like Donko from Taiko no Tatsujin, Hiromi from Burning Force, or Galaga from Galaga.
The Galaga ship is the most alluring, captivating, and enchanting thing in the universe.
However, included in the game are 3 eligible Homestuck characters, Terezi, Jane, and Dave Sprite. The characters are mostly identical to their depictions at the beginning of Act 6, but they're a bit out of their element and instead in high school. Paradox Space was a more traditional comic series that covered events, characters, and concepts related to the Homestuck multiverse. Some of the comics, like the inaugural Death of Mr. 7, have semi-canonical narratives that take place between the panels of Homestuck, whereas comics like Prototyped branch off into alternate timelines just to see what happens. And then there's comics like Summer Teen Romance that just go off the deep end doing their own thing. In this case, an alternate universe story with the Alternian trolls going to the summer camp Camp Scrub. Hiveswap is the most notorious Homestuck video game, as it is the product of a multi-million-dollar Kickstarter to make a proper Homestuck game. It's an episodic point-and-click adventure divided into 4 acts which detail the adventures of Joey Claire, one of Grandpa's abandoned children, who finds a portal that transports her to the alien world of Alternia, where she must live among troll society at its peak. A counterpart named Haunt Switch was planned, which would have a troll go to Earth in her place, but that's never materialized. Only 2 acts of Hiveswap exist after a tumultuous development, and while What Pumpkin haven't pulled the project entirely, I'm not holding my breath that the game will ever be finished. Skyanet Systems Incorporated was a series of logs that expanded on the lore of the Skyanet company and the histories of the Earths within the Homestuck timelines, which don't have much screen time in the comic itself. Here are just a few things that happen in these logs. Grandpa Jake turns out to be Barack Obama's grandfather. Donald Trump's attempts to undermine democracy are actually a scheme to save us from space fascists. The Condess forces comedian Oliver Hardy to be a sex slave. Adolf Hitler does the Holocaust to get revenge against his childhood Jewish friend, Albert Einstein. Yikes. This was received extremely poorly, and it's not hard to see why. Even when these logs aren't plainly anti-Semitic, the depictions of real figures from history in such ahistorical ways just feels gross. Hussey and one of their team members apologized for the offense, claiming the material was old, unvetted, and just wrong. Personally, I believe the apology is sincere, and I welcome personal growth. Unfortunately, this material definitely taints Homestuck. While What Pumpkin have deleted the logs, the information remains, and they were clearly meant to inform the plotline of Earth. There are no contradictions, and no attempts to retcon. If you want to know the history of the Earths in Homestuck, the logs are the missing, gross puzzle pieces, and it's a shame. For example, in the original comic, Dave was an Obama supporter. In Homestuck Squared, Dirk has an autograph from Obama implying that Obama knew about Spurb. In the epilogues, Obama appears as a god-tier player. The logs connect these dots and explain how Obama used Spurb to survive the first destruction of Earth, but this goes on to be the explanation for why Obama's birth certificate was questioned on the next Earth in our timeline, and not, Trump spreading a racist conspiracy theory. It's just a shame. Okay, next is Hiveswap Friendship Simulator, aka FriendSim. It's an anthology series of minigames that effectively serve to take the place of Hiveswap act development. In FriendSim, you play as the MSPA Reader, the audience surrogate, who meets and befriends a total of 38 trolls throughout Alternia. One thing to note about it is that it's like a dating sim, but with friendship. It's just really interesting to have a dating sim with fleshed out characters that is entirely platonic. Though that does mean that anyone hoping for any adult material will have to look elsewhere. Lastly, we have Pester Quest, which built up on the FriendSim formula to have a whole interactive adventure through the sequential befriending of Homestuck characters. You play again as the MSPA reader, but this time you intervene in the stories of characters in the comics. Interestingly, you can change their eventual fates. While for some characters like John, this can result in simple but amusing deviations, but other characters like Dirk and Aridin are given sympathy and a sort of pre-redemption, a chance to live a better life than the road they went down in the comic. By the end of it, the whole thing is just one big happy alternate timeline. But let's finally get to the analysis. Themes. Freedom. The first theme of Homestuck I want to dissect begins as one that's not particularly special to me, but I know that a huge amount of people who enjoyed Homestuck saw it through this lens. I can't deny the truth that Homestuck is a coming-of-age story. When it started in 2009, a significant number of its fans were themselves kids. The characters, being 13 years old, reflected the youth that took part in it. Not only did Homestuck make use of an interactive medium on the internet that few media at the time did, but the content of Homestuck didn't look down upon its audience. It was often intransigent and trolling, sure, but never patronizing them like children. To use an example, if you grew up with the Sonic Adventure games, you might understand what this is like. While other games like Mario and Pokemon had kidnapped princesses and generic gangs, in Sonic, once upon a time, you'd see a mad scientist trying to take the whole world down with him in revenge for a police state murdering his little girl. As a kid, you see games with serious stakes and loss like this, and for once, you feel like you're not just playing a game for kids. Homestuck was like that. And I want to hear from you pedants about how Mario and Pokemon get dark if you look into the lore. I know, but being presented in the course of play is not the same thing as sifting out the darker elements under the surface. I love both of these games as well, but for completely unrelated reasons. And you can just tell with the way Homestuck is written. Even its most ardent haters tend to admit that Hussy's writing style is compelling, whether it's through narration or characterization. If a publisher had written it, they'd probably say it was written at too complex a grade level at times. Most controversially, the writing is covered in cursing, foul language, and sexual allusions. But the thing is, that's part of why so many kids like it. Publishers and corporations try to meter out inappropriate topics for children, but we simply live in a world where young people say really inappropriate things? The main difference between the language of a modern child, or teen, and that of an adult isn't the language, but the understanding that comes with maturity. It's definitely edgy, but I believe kids resonated with characters that actually spoke the way they spoke, albeit exaggerated and verbose, as opposed to sterilized corporate cartoon kids written by 50-year-old writers paid the minimum to maximize toy sales. If that sounds weird to you, keep in mind that this disconnect with children remains with us to this day. It's taken for granted that almost everything that becomes big on platforms like YouTube and Twitch will be watched by thousands of children, no matter how vulgar or sexual the content is. Age gating for both adult and child-targeted content is extremely minimal and effectively just serves as another form of demonetization. So, unsurprisingly, most content is made for a nebulous audience. Not what is traditionally considered family-friendly, but rather adult-friendly without being too adult. Like a Twitch streamer playing Minecraft and making crass jokes. Or like a scary movie the parents play in the living room, knowing the kids won't be hurt by it. I'm not saying these practices don't produce any harm. I'm saying that this laissez-faire tendency in policing appropriate content for children has been a core aspect of the internet for a while, and amidst a background of sterilization in traditional media, Homestuck stood out. The coming-of-age motif is present within the title itself, Homestuck, which is only overtly referenced a single time in the entire comic, but the underlying message is present throughout. From the very beginning of the comic, the audience, various characters, and particularly John, are trying to escape their home. While this is certainly a continuation of previous MSPA stories, I think you could extend this theme throughout a lot of Hussy's work. Whether it's a story about escaping a jail, an office, or one's own home, there is a through line here of escaping confinement. However, there's a noticeable shift here with Homestuck. MSPA's previous escapes had been from adult environments, whereas Homestuck has children escaping a place that should be familiar, comforting, wholesome. But it's not. Something is wrong. While this can be as innocuous as the simple troubles of a teen coming into the world with an inept parent, it can just as easily be read as a dysfunctional, coercive, or even abusive living situation. And make no mistake, the parents are inept, always drawn in a style without voices or proper faces, like they are otherworldly figures that tower over the kids, guardians not as nurturers but as golems, walls that might keep you safe but ultimately trapped. The trolls take this dynamic even further, depicting their parental figures as literal monsters, ranging from friendly pets to Lovecraftian leviathans. There's almost a kids next door kind of storytelling with the parents, where the children are the ones really calling the shots, having to guide their foolish parents that just think they know what they're doing. It's not hard to see why so many young people, especially on Tumblr, related to this situation, feeling alienated from their parents and trapped in their own homes. However, Homestuck pushes this theme into something more broad as it goes on, as readers aged. Many call Homestuck a sort of unfolding box, where the scope gets broader and broader, but you can also read that as escaping multiple levels of confinement. So as the characters age from 13 to 16, we see the motif of escaping the home shift to escaping normality, or in essence, the distillation of freedom. From norms, society, reality, even physics, but most importantly, control. John can't simply escape his home, so he escapes the Earth entirely. But then he has to escape Loas, and then his game session, and then Paradox Space, and then the Alpha Timeline, and then Homestuck itself. That's not to say that Homestuck is some libertarian wet dream about not stepping on my freedoms. Numerous characters are shown to make wrong, dubiously ethical, and even evil decisions in their quest to escape, and become the boot to control and dominate others. Frequently, characters like Eridan or Caliborn are shown to have chosen evil, hurting and killing people around them. And I feel like this is Homestuck's way of saying that freedom is good, but what you choose to do with that freedom may not be. One thing I love about this is that Homestuck even follows up on those parent-child relationships to show how right or wrong the child was. In John's case, his dad really did truly love him. He meant well, but was terrible at showing it in a way that John could understand. John wasn't wrong to feel trapped, but he's able to later look back and realize that he also could have tried better to understand his father. After his dad dies, he eventually meets an alternate timeline version of him, which is a sweet reunion, but he's not his dad. It's not the same. And there's this brilliant scene in Homestuck Squared where, as an adult, John's physical home, his only remaining tie to his youth and his parent, is destroyed. And it's just tragic. Like, John realizes in that moment that he lost something of greater value than he ever knew. Yet, at the same time, the comic shows us that not all children are simply blissfully unaware of their parents' good nature. Rose has a passive-aggressive feud with an alcoholic mom that leaves her with complex feelings from how she did indeed love her mom, but that doesn't change that their household was a dysfunctional mess no kid should endure. Dave's even worse off, with his older bro neglecting him nearly to the point of abandonment, complete with actual abuse in the form of combat training. When he eventually meets an alternate timeline version of his bro, the guy apologizes to Dave on behalf of his other self. Vriska is probably the most extreme example of this, as her Spider Mom is often cited among fans, and a few times within the comic, as the impetus for her abusive behavior. Spider Mom forced Vriska to kill others as a young kid, so are we that surprised that she continued the cycle of abuse long after? Homestuck doesn't directly provide an answer to that question, but it shows there's utility to asking questions like that. Immortality. Throughout Homestuck, the characters continually have to reassess and learn about their self-identities through the confrontation of death. That is to say that Homestuck makes the implicit claim that the best way to truly know the self is to come face to face with death. It was literally a meme within the community that all your favorite characters would be killed by Hussy. Hussy even killed their own self-insert. Initially though, this is done through the deaths of the parents and guardians of the main characters, where the young teens that thought they could raise themselves and save the world become faced with the reality that they will now actually have to raise themselves and save the world. Whether the character chooses to reflect and possibly regret their assertiveness, or instead to embrace the freedom with a heavy heart, we learn about these characters and see them develop and self-actualize as we read the comic. The confronting of death continues when main characters themselves start dying. For example, when Eridan killed Kanaya, at least temporarily, Karkat was hit by her death the hardest, and had to suddenly learn to be an actual leader. The character who spent most of the comic claiming to be the leader while just arguing with himself has to actually take action to just try to prevent more of his friends from dying. And he manages at least some amount of success. While this arc for him is not a continuous climb as he does fumble later, his rise to a role of actual leadership is spurred in large part by the death of his comrades. This theme, however, achieves its final form when characters start confronting their own deaths, not just in the form of danger or the possibility of death, but its unshakable certainty. Homestuck's zany plot frequently employs cloning, time travel, alternate timelines, and alternate universes, and so a character having to come to terms with another version of themselves dying is not just normal, but it's extremely rare that a character doesn't experience it. Dave is one of the first characters to have to deal with this. As a time traveler, he forms a mantra that dead Daves are the enemy, as he steels his resolve to avoid sacrificing other versions of himself. This culminates throughout the comic to him swearing off time travel altogether because he doesn't want to risk being responsible for killing himself, a decision which, ironically, results in him getting killed. Another version of Dave that survives beyond this point learns the lesson that there are some battles dire enough to be worth dying for, worth risking the lives of others and other selves. To contrast, Arati is another time traveler who felt so nihilistic that she literally throws thousands of herselves at her enemies, and while it's a viable strategy, she's left lost and without purpose upon being the sole survivor. The main characters, as players of Spurb, are even directly faced with their own death at a minimum of 3 different points along their quest. First, each player is granted an extra life in the form of a dream self, which by its name evokes a sort of juvenile wishfulness, often complete with the personality of its bearer, but less reserved, with less walls. However, by functioning as an extra life in a dangerous game, their existence is meant to be disposable, or at least in reserve as the main life is disposed. Then, in order for a player to ascend to godhood, they must literally die on the quest bed, a mechanic that solely exists to make the player consciously choose a time and place to dispose of their lives as a knowing sacrifice to a greater cause. It's as if Super Mario was aware of each life he lost in his adventure to thwart Bowser. The third point is when the player faces a denizen, who gives them a binary choice of sacrifice. A common response to the incessant death found in Homestuck is for a character to seek an escape to death. Resurrection comes in many forms, like sprite prototyping, time shenanigans, and life powers. But the concept of gods comes in many forms as well, like First Guardians, Horror Terrors, The Afterlife, Lord English, the literal author, and God tiers. God tiers are especially relevant for being the main way characters can ascend to godhood, and they do it through their confrontation of death. So in confronting the death of the dream self, the player can ascend to a godly, more powerful self. The epilogues take this idea of pursuing immortality and escape from death and the self to the extreme with the introduction of the ultimate self, a point when a character realizes that they are just a character. Fictional. In essence, death is simply the raising of stakes for a person to confront who they really are, and immortality in Homestuck effectively serves to just compound how much someone has themselves reflected back onto them, whether they like it or not. So it shouldn't be surprising that a number of characters who seek or accept immortality have copious amounts of self-loathing. The god tiers have limits that are purely narrative, centered around heroism and justice. And pretty much any character that is good accepts these limits, for seeking to break them will incur more lives, more other selves, and for what? So you specifically can live longer? Caliborn's quest could be described as an ignorant team desperately trying to claw at true immortality no matter the cost, lest he give others the chance to kill him first. Meanwhile, Dirk is a fascinating study of someone whose identity is so recursive that he has to manufacture an identity for himself because he doesn't even know who he is anymore. However, we can't fully talk about Caliborn and Dirk without talking about how they are both aware that they are fictional. Meta commentary. Meta commentary has been in Homestuck from the very beginning, as the comic started with user suggestions, and even then, the comic didn't always give what the users wanted, often playing on their expectations and subverting them, to various levels of success. Meta commentary isn't unique to Homestuck, as plenty of media engages in it, especially these days. Infamously, the live-action Disney remakes are just full with meta commentary, each one making revisions to improve the source material based on common and shallow critiques of the original animated ones that have been out for decades. This often results in movies that are certainly more diverse and realistic looking than the originals, but in trying to address half-baked criticism, Disney will attempt to over-explain what had previously been told more effectively through the language of cinematography and make the movies drag. The difference with Homestuck, however, is that Homestuck has always been obsessed with meta-commentary and was built with it in mind. Constantly, the reader interacting with characters is incorporated visibly into the narrative, with other characters influencing the protagonist through suggestions or facile commands, ranging from the mayor in a spur station to Ultimate Dirk doing his thing. At no point does your immersion in Homestuck demand that you forget that it's a piece of fiction, as the work demands that you recognize it's fake and then dares you to care anyway. And honestly, I kind of respect that bold honesty, even if it can be pretty trolly at times. Several characters are made with meta-commentary in mind. The first batch of 12 trolls were mostly made by Hussey, but they did have some input from the community. Later, their ancestors would be entirely made as stereotypes of online personality types, especially on Tumblr, where Homestuck fans were a notorious presence. However, the greatest example of this are with the Cherubs, Calliope and Caliborn. The two are meant to represent the fandom directly in two parts, identifying the good and the bad. Calliope is meant to be the nice, studious fan who goes on a vicarious journey of martyrdom to join the characters that she loves so much. However, by this point in the comic, Homestuck had accrued a number of anti-fans that loved to hate Homestuck, and Caliborn is meant to represent them. Caliborn is not a mustache-twirling villain, but he's also not some Marvel villain who has a tragic backstory to justify doing the evil he does. No one made Caliborn do the things he does. He is a product of his circumstances, yes, like everyone, but he made choices. And honestly, I find this incredibly intriguing, because it's a much more real look at the losers and hateful people that populate this world than what you'll see in most media. Most people aren't hateful because they are principally evil, nor are they hateful because of some specific tragedy that made them this way. Most people become hateful because it's normalized to them. They just have nothing better to do in their pitiful lives. It's a shield from self-loathing and inadequacy, and that's Caliborn. Caliborn is the first player to rise to the position of author, taking over after his future self kills Hussey, and he does so with gusto. His arc is that of the hater, a bitter, nihilistic, conceited person who witnesses a plethora of beautiful art and arrogantly thinks he can do better. And he does try, but he's consistently shown to be parasitic in his art. While Homestuck was known to reuse assets and be dodgy on matters of copyright, there's a clear delineation between where Homestuck was transformative and Caliborn's version of it, plagiarist. The fact that Caliborn even turned out to be a crypto bro was just perfect. But ultimately, what makes Caliborn a perfect villain isn't just that he's evil, it's that he genuinely loves Homestuck more than anyone else. But he only knows how to express love through hatred. He truly is the anti-fan incarnate. When the original comic came to an end, the white door symbolized an exit from the comic, the players being able to escape continuity. Noticeably, as the main cast goes for that door, Caliborn instead rejects it, turning back inward into Homestuck, refusing to ever let go. I can't help but notice the similarity in this theme to Undertale, a game made by Toby Fox during one of Homestuck's pauses. You can see where the two had inspiration on each other, and Undertale similarly makes a statement that people who don't know when to let an experience be over can cause a great amount of harm. In Homestuck, this is what Caliborn does, genociding to keep playing Homestuck. In Undertale, the genocide route simulates this same phenomenon, but with you in the driver's seat. However, when Homestuck ended, there was a notable shift in meta-commentary towards canonity. The sequel is called Beyond Canon for a reason, which is effectively the ethos for this evolution of the theme. The idea is that the original comic alone is the canon of Homestuck, and What Pumpkin, the authors, have made it explicitly clear that any continuation is not canon, not the one true sequel. In essence, this move is a gesture towards fanfiction and fanworks, saying that their works can just as legitimately continue the legacy of Homestuck. The epilogues show this by the simple fact that there are 2 of them, so even What Pumpkin couldn't narrow it down on just one. Homestuck Squared takes this idea and elaborates on it with the Ultimate Self, where multiple characters directly interface as the narration and overtly influence the lesser fictional beings. Unfortunately, having this theme go beyond canon is undermined by What Pumpkin's entire existence. Giving license to your fans to make fan works is nice in theory, but what would have happened if someone else tried to commercialize their Homestuck fan work beyond ad revenue? Furthermore, can you really say that no continuation is official when one of them is officially published by the company that owns the intellectual property of Homestuck? Even if you try to make that claim, people are going to look at the dozen or so pieces of fanfiction, they're going to look at Homestuck Squared, seeing that it's made by the people who made Homestuck, and they will usually give it a sort of credence that other fanfiction won't get. You just can't say we've actually collectively gone beyond canon in the real world when you're still publishing and making addendums of their own canonity. It's a nice idea, but it really just feels like something that What Pumpkin entertains out of a hypothetical grace. Because in reality, as the IP owners, what they make is Homestuck, and takes precedence over anything anyone else makes. Or at least their owners' viz do. Maybe one day that will change. Right now, that's the capitalist world we live in. Queer culture. The last theme I'd like to discuss is how Homestuck embraces queer culture. In the beginning, Homestuck was a dorky webcomic on the internet making a bunch of programmer jokes, and so it's not surprising that the first 3 acts are particularly straight. But something changed, and it wasn't Homestuck at first. It was the audience. As young people flocked towards Homestuck and contributed to the community, their perspectives often bled into the comic. A lot of the programmers and nerds that had been first in the Homestuck fandom too had chances to reflect upon themselves, like Hussey themselves would. Things started to get gayer, and protests within the community about this started to be ignored as a minority of bigots. Homestuck is particularly good at embracing queer culture without being too overt about it, using metaphors and contrivances to give representation without using the words that would trigger would-be bigots. But I'd like to drop the facade and just point out how much latent queerness pervades this comic to show how much Homestuck did not shy away from queerness. The first time Hussey did this dance in Homestuck was with the Midnight Crew's appearance in the intermission. Each of the 4 members has a smut magazine that shows where their lust lies. For HB, he adores the red cheeks of a plump heart. For CD, he adores long strips of licorice. These characters are later shown to be sexless Carapacians from another world, and it plants the idea that maybe alien creatures would have a different view of love and sex than we humans might. When DD is revealed to have an actual smut magazine with naked women, it's played as a joke that his interest, which is fairly vanilla in reality, is seen in the comic as equally lascivious by his cohorts. Okay, yes, while Slick is shown to also be into Carapacian women, his smut are literal terriers, which is definitely bad, I know, but for context, he doesn't even really know what a dog even... Well, it was a start. Act 4 introduces a gag where minor pet-like characters would be assigned names and genders from multiple parties unknowingly, making them go by feminine names and pronouns at times, but masculine names and pronouns at other times. Casey, she is just a little salamander, but also Viceroy, he is a skilled necromancer. Same would later be done with Vodka Mutini, aka Dr. Meowgan Spangler, as well as Liv Tyler, aka Terry Kaiser. We'd also be introduced to the Trolls, and in Hivebent, the Quadrants would be introduced. Several trolls would engage in unabashed queer behavior, with Gamzee, Kanaya, and Eridan being gay for Tavros, Vriska, and everyone, respectively. By Act 5, Act 2, we'd see it finally established that this was not an accident. Troll society is bisexual by default, and trolls are so bi that they don't even have a word for it. While this can play a little into a sort of colorblind trope, just replacing race with sexuality, no possible downside of such a trope can realistically outweigh the effect that making half your cast bi like this has. With such sheer, overwhelming bisexuality, Homestuck had been cemented as queer media at this point, even if it was irreverent about it. From there, Rose and Kanaya start to become an interspecies lesbian ship, and we even see the ancestor Mindfang was bi. We learn about the Signless, aka Troll Jesus, whose entire motivations were centered around equality, but with an emphasis on free love. Yet more implicit support. You might see why the Homestuck fandom and the progressives of Tumblr overlapped so much back in the day. When Act 6 rebooted the human protagonists, a notable change is just how queer they are. Dirk is gay, Jake is bi, and Roxy is pan. Act 6 Intermission 3 gives us a whole new universe of trolls that, guess what, are all bi or some form of queer. Act 6 Act 4 shows Dirk and Jake as a ship. And then Act 6, right up to the end, gives us Charms, Mina and Vriska, Terezi and Vriska, Dave and Carcat, and then the first proper non-binary character, Dave Ebida Sprite Squared. So, Homestuck has been gay, nearly the whole time. But what was particularly fascinating to me was the quadrant system. The idea is that Troll Society has, instead of our arbitrary conventions about being straight, gay, or bi, an entirely different arbitrary set of conventions regarding romance, love, and sex. There's 2 axes that separate the reproductive from the conciliatory, and the positive from the negative. While trolls know little of what it means to be straight, we humans know little of the quadrants outside of the vanilla matespritship. I won't mince words. This idea was radical, and deeply impacted the comic since its inception. By introducing various forms of love in the form of a fictional, alternate set of societal rules, the quadrants helped to normalize queer forms of love to the readers and acted as a safe springboard for queer subjects, often functioning as a smokescreen for how gay the trolls were being. And that's not even to mention how the quadrant system is inherently supportive of polyamory, as the arbitrary standards ask participants to attempt to fill all 4 for a simultaneous set of 5 partners. One of the quadrants gives you 2, it's weird. Matesmanship is what we typically romanticize as soulmates, as a positive love but specifically with sexual intent. More allegiance is the positive conciliatory love, and it represents the kind of love that 2 especially close friends might have when they love each other despite not wanting to be romantic or intimate. The negative loves are a bit more controversial. Auspisticism is the negative conciliatory love that is meant to be a romanticized take on bickering. The ideal of this kind of love is a bickering but loving couple that is only able to work through counseling with a trusted mediator, with that mediator position being the most taxing of the quadrant paradigm. It's an interesting concept, but it just feels to me like a romanticization of affairs, which isn't so bad, but it's a way to make the 3-prong club work. Kismicitude is the negative reproductive love, often called a hate love. It's a difficult concept to grasp, and it's easy to use to justify abuse. It's not hard to find Homestuck fans misusing or shying away from this type of love because of the associations with romantic and sexual abuse. But honestly, I think it's more nuanced than that. The ideal Kismeces are meant to be rivals with romantic tension, like some incarnations of Batman and Catwoman. The problem is that there needs to be a balance of power between the participants, and should one be more powerful, a willingness to ease up. It's not really about hate. It just plays on the word hate as a sort of innuendo, in much the way the word love is abused to mean a million things. You can love your life, your kid, your wife, your squid, but all in different ways. Likewise, you can hate as in hate, or hate as in hate. Homestuck later even acknowledges how Kismicitude can be used as a cover for actual abuse, when Terezi realizes her Kismecis, Gamzee, has just been abusing her. And that's not even the best parts. See? Quadrants were a hit. Fans loved them. Fans even tried to use them in real life. Forget drama with love triangles. Hello, love quadrangles. The forums actually had to clamp down on this, kind of overdoing it in my opinion. But Homestuck would later parody the quadrants with an even more complex and arbitrary system. The charms were a 3x3 grid of 9 types of love represented by lucky charms that was endemic to the leprechauns that would eventually become the Felt. The whole thing is completely ridiculous, with Felt members engaging in multi-charm relationships that we can't even understand beyond being some kind of super gay, and honestly, I love it. It's like the comic is responding to the fandom's exuberance of the quadrant system and provided a rebuttal in the form of a more complex and silly foil. The charms leave an implication that systems of love with arbitrary but concrete rules are just inherently silly and limiting. Why stop at 9, try 16, 25, a million, infinite, or perhaps none? In a way, the charms show us the tedium of categorizing and systematizing concepts as arbitrary as love, sexuality, and gender. And I can't help but be reminded of the kinds of people that think of non-binary as simply a third gender and fail to imagine beyond that. It's an argument for abolition of gender, sexuality, and love for the sake of freedom and equality, like the Signless preached, and as Jade would later advocate in the epilogues. And that brings us to what came after the original comic. So, there is a commonly levied critique directed towards the epilogues and Homestuck Squared by former fans that claims that the content after the conclusion of Homestuck gayed and transed up a bunch of the pre-existing characters. Yeah, it's basically the argument of, oh, I don't hate LGBT people, I just think you should make new characters if you really want that, instead of forcing that on existing characters. Something woke agenda. And this is nonsense. I can't believe that I've seen leftists and liberals make these arguments alongside the usual suspects on the political right. So I'm going to set the record straight. Here is all of the queer character representation in just the original comic. 1 non-binary, made up of Sprite Squared. 2 pansexuals, Cronus and Roxy. 2 lesbians, Kanaya and Rose. 3 gender fluid beings, the mutant kitten, salamander, and uber bunny. 4 queers, CD, DD, HB, and Jack, as previously explained. And then 15 gays, Biscuits, Cans, Clover, Crowbar, Die, Dirk, Doze, Eggs, Finn, Itchy, Matchsticks, Quarters, Sawbuck, Stitch, and Trace. Followed by a whopping 23 bisexuals. Aradia, Damara, Dave, Equius, Eridan, Pfeffery, Gamzee, Horace, Jake, Cancri, Carcrack, Carlos, Latula, Mina, Mulin, Matuna, Nepeta, Porum, Rufio, Solix, Tavros, Terezi, and Vriska! Add all those up, and you have queer identities represented in Homestuck proper a literal 50 times. And how many times were added in the epilogues and Homestuck Squared? Well, let's see. 3 transgenders, Calliope, Amode, and Roxy. 2 more non-binaries, Calliope and Amode. 2 more bisexuals, Jane and Obama. 1 more pansexual, Jade. 1 queer, Hussy. 1 asexual, Calliope again, and 1 intersex, Jade. That's just 11. 11 additional queer folks added to the previous 50. And the only major changes were to Calliope and Roxy, 2 characters. So, let me be clear when I say this. The idea that Homestuck was ruined by later content gaying everyone up, or doing token representation in lieu of making new characters, is complete garbage. Even if the critique was curtailed to include Act 6, it's still naive. Homestuck has been gaying up their characters the whole time. Bigots either failed to notice or just pretended not to. A kernel of truth here, though, is that the epilogues and sequel did become more overt in its queer representation. And frankly, I think it was warranted. Homestuck Squared doesn't make an alien system to ease in transness to the audience. It doesn't need quadrants. It just shows Roxy becoming a trans man and calls him what he is. That's the real difference. And to be honest, I think there was certainly value to the irreverence of earlier Homestuck. But it's been a decade. The readers have grown up. I think there's an unfortunate amount of allegories and analogues used in fiction for social issues and movements for equality, because unfortunately much of modern society, especially here in America, is completely illiterate to media analysis. Too often these analogues just go ignored by the people that really need to be confronted with them. Again, there is value, but at a certain point, it's time to drop the pretense and just own up to your values. A good troll knows when to show their hand. If I may, I wanted to address Roxy, Calliope, and Jade specifically in their queerness. I think the way Roxy and Calliope were made to be trans was honestly a bit clever. Not counting the new minor character Amode, they are the only 2 characters allowed to become trans. And Roxy only does so in the Meet epilogue. I say allowed deliberately, as it is revealed that Dirk controls the narrative. It's established that Roxy's void powers allow him to evade his thoughts from even the omnipotent narrator, and we can presume this goes for their non-binary partner Calliope, who also has an ultimate alt-self. Furthermore, when Roxy first tries to go by they-them pronouns, Dirk responds brusquely, clearly trying to downplay how it makes him uncomfortable. This has an unsettling implication that it's not a coincidence that the only protagonists who became transgender were the ones that ultimate Dirk had difficulty controlling, i.e., Dirk literally uses his influence as the self-proclaimed perpetuator of canon to clamp down on the transing of established characters. It's genius. Oh, and about Jade. She was the subject of some controversy when it was revealed in Homestuck Squared that she has had a phallus ever since she merged with Beck. Some readers were grossed out at the idea that a cisgender woman would magically just have a phallus, and to make it worse, it's kind of a dog's phallus. And at first I got these criticisms, but the more I thought about it, the more I just thought, who cares? She's a consenting adult who was granted traits from a semi-omnipotent god dog in a wacky world where things like that happen. Sprite fusions have made non-binary characters before, so why not have one be intersex? Is the problem that it's unrealistic for an intersex person to be made that way and not born that way? Sure. But since when do we expect Homestuck to care about realism? Homestuck's litigation of the existence of magic was a literal joke. Are people just presuming bestial intentions from the fact that she's both sexual and dog-like? These people know furries exist, right? Jade's a furry. Oh, don't tell these folks that you can find plenty of queer art of anthropomorphic characters with animalistic traits, including the genitals. Furries aren't harming anyone, whether PG or NC-17. And besides, Jade isn't portrayed with any pornographic intent. The fact she has a phallus is just established as part of her character as a vehicle to establish her plot-relevant child. While bashing furries is an unfortunately common practice on the internet, I can't help but think that a lot of the criticism towards Jade's queerness is a result of latent heteronormativity, even among progressives, to the point that a lot of them misidentify what it is just because there's a magical element to it. And that's just really sad to me. My partner Kira wanted to say something on this specifically.
I have a chromosomal abnormality. That means I only have one X chromosome, and I really appreciate the representation of an intersex character, especially since Jade had always been completely unconcerned about gender and sexuality throughout the comic. I thought the way they handled this was really amusing. I especially liked how John was just as oblivious as his 13-year-old self and had to be told by Rose that Jade and her had a biological child for him to get it.
Characters. Humans. When Act 7 was released, the fandom resounded with the message of Homestuck has finally become the anime it was destined to be. This sentiment reflects how many people in the fandom had drawn comparisons between the comic and anime, as opposed to traditional paper comics. While this is surely in part due to the animations and utilitarian art style, I think it's also because one of the strongest aspects of anime tends to be characterization. Anime protagonists may be thrown against otherworldly foes and odds, but often the focus of the story isn't the enemies they face, or even the socio-political dynamics of the world, but rather the characters who have to live in it, especially those around the protagonists. And I think Homestuck tends to do characterization this way as well. People glomp onto favorite characters, even ones that get little screen time, because the writing convinces many readers of the humanity behind each character. Sometimes this can even be a problem when characters act in evil ways and some diehard fans just can't come to terms with that. So in this next part, I wanted to do some character analysis because I think it's equally as important as the broader themes. What does each character represent? Who are they? What are they? I've already covered a bunch, so I'll try my best to not rehash what's already been discussed. First up, humans. John, Rose, Dave, and Jade were the Beta Kids, the humans who played the Spur Beta in the B1 timeline, and as the first batch of characters, they are the most influential. Let's start with John, who is basically the protagonist of Homestuck, and as such, personally embodies the coming-of-age theme throughout it. There were plans to have John transition in Homestuck Squared as June eventually, But unfortunately this never came to fruition, and we never got to see her make her appearance. I've talked about Rose and Jade a lot already, so let's move on to the author's self-insert. That's right, Dave. No, seriously. Sure, Hussey does have a literal self-insert, but the real self-insert is Dave. It's clear to me from the writing that some of Hussey's long soliloquies started to bleed into Dave. You can chart Dave's slow transition from rapping dork to introspective, meandering mess of contradictions that seems to have happened with Hussey, at least from a narration perspective. One time, there was a Paradox-based comic that had a controversial scene of body horror with Tavros that Hussey ended up redacting within days with a rushed monologue from Dave. So at the very least, I think we have to recognize that Hussey felt very comfortable with Dave's voice to do this as a response to sudden backlash. But I think it's emblematic of the overlap in tone between this character and the author. With this framing in mind, Dave's leftist leanings and interest in Obama match Hussey making the comic more and more lean that way, along with his insistence in including Obama as a character. It also makes Dave's reflective ramblings about self, sexuality, and gender make a lot more sense. Dave is firmly a guy, but Hussey is not. Then there's the Guardians, whose role is plainly self-evident early on, but there's an extra layer of nuance introduced in Act 6, where it turns out that the Guardians are adult, parental versions of the other kids. Comparing them to their adult selves serves to humanize characters that had previously been dehumanized. And there's just a tragedy in people being forced to irrelevance, having to raise the generation that will hopefully save us all. Jane, Jake, Roxy, and Dirk were the Alpha Kids, the humans who played the Spurb Alpha in the B2 timeline. As mentioned, they are gayer, but they are also more morally complicated. Jane is a conservative who later becomes a fascist and the very empress she had usurped. Jake tends to get coerced into supporting villains, but is ultimately a victim himself. Dirk is irony poison and uses it as a cover to cause mass suffering through his machinations. But he wasn't always like this. Roxy is the only one that really escapes unscathed, but even then, she can be remarkably complacent as her friends do real evil until it's nearly too late. Sprites. Sprites are game abstractions within Spurb that the players and readers will first encounter, filling the role as friendly mentor NPCs that drip feed cryptic info while also acting as a resurrection mechanic. The unique concept, rarity of sprites, and multitudinous combinations of prototyped components makes them a bit mysterious, with abilities of sprites still being discovered even late into Act 6, Act 6. The existence of squared sprites, where sprites are prototyped by other sprites, even implies that sprites could be chained together in sequence, into even higher exponents. Unfortunately, Homestuck seemed to be done with sprites after the B1 timeline. The troll sprites are rarely shown, and the B2 sprites are kinda just used as jokes half the time. As the comic neared its end, sprites only seemed to be used narratively as a method of exploring doomed or resurrected characters, with the squared sprites perhaps being the closest to a Deus Ex Machina that Homestuck got. I think this was a bit of a missed opportunity to explore this strange state of being. I think chaining sprites and character fusions together could have been an interesting way to fight Lord English with a literal symbol of unity. As it stands, several sprites survived by the end of the comic, including 2 Aarquia sprites, G. Catavros sprite, Aracial sprite, Jasper sprite, Jaspero's sprite squared, and 2 Nana sprites. Devoto Sprite Squared gets a farewell in the epilogues, and Jaspero Sprite Squared makes a cameo in a bonus story in Homestuck Squared, but not a single non-squared sprite is ever seen beyond the credits. It just seems to me like a waste of the fused and alternate characters existing in a state of limbo. We know an Aarquia sprite later becomes part of Lord English, but which one or under what circumstances are left purely speculative. First Guardians. The first Guardians are game abstractions and narrative devices that take the concept of Guardian to its extreme, with each being the guardian of an entire planet. Beckwhirl and Godcat take the form of familiar animals as they each protect an Earth, each taking attributes stereotypically associated with the animal. Beck is loyal to a fault, Godcat is aloof and independent. Doc Scratch, on the other hand, is meant to be alien, much like the world he represents. And I gotta be honest, he is an amazing villain. And even though he exits the comic only halfway through, he does so having won. He got everything he wanted. And that's just so rare to see for interesting villains and stories these days. I personally love how he knows almost everything he will ever do, but takes enjoyment in the dance anyway, making his own challenges for fun, like manipulating whole populations while technically never telling a lie. His physicality as a superintelligence and a puppet serve narrative purposes to his relation to Cal and role as a host, but it's his personality that makes him one of the most devilish presences in all of Homestuck, as well as the first to challenge the author directly. Trolls. The trolls are often seen as the most iconic symbols of Homestuck, and that they are even recognizable outside of the fandom with the titular candy corn colored horns. They're meant to be alternate universe aliens that are superficially similar to humans, but have vast anatomical and cultural differences. Their reproduction is notoriously complex, and their biology is really more bug-like than mammalian. Only the mother grub can birth new larvae, but all trolls can contribute to the process, regardless of sex. Also, the trolls have a unique relationship with their monstrous guardians, the Luci. However, the most defining characteristic of troll biology is the hemospectrum, a caste system built on a hierarchy endemic to this species. There are 12 castes which range from the more psychically powerful, but shorter-lived, to the longer-lived but less gifted, though each caste has its own quirks. They also become less common and more aquatic on the higher end, with the highest caste consisting of only a few individuals who are entirely amphibious. The castes are divided by 12 blood colors trolls have: burgundy, bronze, gold, lime, olive, jade, teal, cerulean, indigo, purple, violet, and fuchsia. The hemospectrum basically exists to create a fictional axis of oppression in Homestuck's attempt to talk about social politics without directly talking about similar axes in our real world. I think it works at what it does while also allowing for some fun supernatural powers for the alien species. It's basically an alternate society with problems just alien enough to make its readers fall into a false sense of security, as similar socio-political policies to that of humanity can be examined. The first group of 12 trolls were those that played Scrub, the troll version of Spurb. There's a lot of trolls, so I'll try to be brief on most of them. Aradia's quest is to find purpose and meaning despite the prevalence of death and suffering. Tavros is a sweet boy who manages to overcome his massive self-esteem issues. Solix is a nihilist who keeps surviving his nihilism. Nepeta is a sweet girl whose life is cut short too soon. Equius is a racist who grows and learns but ultimately is murdered by his supposed superior. Gamzee is a whimsical stoner who radicalized into a patriarchal religious extremist. Pfeffery is the embodiment of if I was queen, everyone would be happy. Eridan's an incel. Sorry, but he is. Also, literally a sea-dweller supremacist who commits genocides. It's implied that in some alternate timelines he managed to be better, but Alpha Eridan in the main timeline is just awful. I know there's still Karkat, Kanaya, Terezi, and Vriska, but I'll circle back to them in a moment. Those 12 trolls had their ancestors, from whom they took inspiration in their beliefs and styles. The Handmaid was a time slave, the Summoner was the hero Tavros dreamed to be, the Psionic was doomed like Solix, the Sufferer was Troll Jesus, the Disciple carries his legacy, the Dolorosa was Troll Virgin Mary, Red Glare was a Troll Cup, Mindfang was a bougie pirate who later had a heel turn, Darklear was a traitor to the Empire. The Grand High Blood was 2 popes? Dual Scar was a joke. The Condess was... well, she is the fascist incarnate, effectively the alternate universe version of Hitler. Her main power is that she never ages, and she uses this to survive everything that's thrown at her, amassing more and more power, even becoming subservient to Lord English, just to keep going and keep ruling perceived lesser beings. Everything bad Jane later becomes, she learned from the Condesce. Then there are the last batch of 12 trolls introduced in Homestuck, the Dancestors, named after their confusing relationship between ancestor and descendant. Basically, just like the humans were split into two groups that each raised the other in an alternate timeline, so too were the trolls. These are alternate versions of the ancestors that played Scrub before the ones we knew did. Unfortunately, the character designs for these trolls was significantly more shallow, often just being parodies of online internet archetypes. Latula is the stereotypical gamer girl. Horus is mostly just a weirdo. Cronus is a creep that tries to co-opt progressive language. Kurlos is a goof who turns out to actually be working with the enemy. Tamara is a racist caricature of a promiscuous Japanese woman. Mulin speaks only in memes. Rufio is a socially inept lover boy. Matuna is barely intelligible in a way that's meant to parody 4chan users, but it's portrayed as brain damage and an ableist caricature. Mina's in an interesting position of idolizing her older self while also positioning herself against her, making her the good Condesce by simply being on the opposing side. Okay, so I saved the most interesting trolls for last. Let's start with Kankri and Porum. Kankri is supposedly a parody of social justice warriors, and Porum online feminists, both heavily influenced by Tumblr. That sounds really bad, right? Like some half-baked conservative parodies that don't even understand what they're satirizing, yeah? These characters are even introduced in the same chapter as the racist and ableist caricatures. Well, actually, surprisingly, no. Clearly Hussey still had some latent bigotry at the time, but I believe they also had some legitimate critiques of progressivism from a progressive perspective that was put into these two characters. Kankri speaks in essay format, detailing with extreme specificity almost every possible avenue of oppression and privilege imaginable. While he is smug and righteous, if you only assess the arguments he makes, you'll realize that he's right? Like, he's just right, for the most part. He knows more about the hemo spectrum than anyone else, from his unique perspective of a mutant blood, and he's also able to speak on racism, ableism, and obscure types of bigotry and oppression without proper names. However, his analysis has a major blind spot: sexism. And that just so happens to be the issue that Porum dedicates herself to. Kankri denies that sexism even exists in the matriarchal troll society, even as Porum explains that the matriarchy was superficial, masking a greater patriarchy. Porum's feminism is shown to just be correct, with her voice as a reliable voice of reason. Other characters try to demean her by pointing out her sexual history, but she simply isn't ashamed of it. The fact that she even lovingly mothers Kankri for he had no guardian makes it clear that his rejection of feminism is indeed a personal slight that reveals he's willing to compromise his beliefs to be petty. Kankri is also meant to be Karkat's foil. Both characters advocate for radical equality, but in radically different ways. Karkat is incredibly crass, insulting, and profane, but that is merely an aggressive rhetoric he uses as he fights for his friends, comrades, and what's right. Whether that's him being a leader in his youth, him running for president for troll rights, or fighting a revolution for troll equality. Kankri, on the other hand, speaks eloquently, at length, and with carefully chosen language. But that is a smokescreen of progressive rhetoric he uses to justify his arrogance among people that would otherwise agree with him on many issues. Kankri talks a big game, but only to serve his own interests, while Karkat does what's right and doesn't deign to be polite about it. In essence, Kankri isn't just satirizing SJWs, but a specific kind, that of the woke scold, who weaponizes the language of progressivism to abuse his allies as a response to his own trauma and powerlessness. This contrast shows the heroism of both the Signless and Karkat, the latter of which later is able to move past his own self-loathing to do what's right. Porum, meanwhile, is also meant to be Kanaya's foil, Kanaya was never as sexual as Porum, even into her adulthood, and she is unique in being the only lesbian troll of the bunch. The contrast between the two doesn't really set them against each other in as much as it shows that they are two halves of the same whole. They're like two different waves of an alternate feminism. It's not that women need to be more or less sexual, so they ought to be allowed to choose as they will. And then there's Vriska, the most controversial character in the entirety of Homestuck. So, some of you might be wondering whether I'm going to defend or admonish her, but honestly, she's just more nuanced than that. Her saving grace is that she is one of the most competent and ruthless characters in the entire comic, making her an invaluable ally, but that comes at great cost. Often she creates the very scenarios that she needs to solve to justify her relevance, and she bullies, belittles, and even kills the people she cares about in a misguided effort to make them better. Vriska's story is that of a kid who was abused and groomed in a fascist society to being a monster in order to survive that society. Aranea is meant to be Vriska's foil. Whereas Vriska needed to load the dice to prove her competence, Aranea is naturally competent and represents everything Vriska wishes she was. What Aranea and Vriska have in common is they cannot stand to not be seen as the heroes. However, where Vriska actually does care about her friends in a twisted fashion, Aranea views everyone around her only as cogs in a greater machine driving the plot. In many ways, Aranea foreshadows what Dirk will eventually become, even sharing his love for monologuing. Meanwhile, Terezi was Vriska's childhood friend who helped her deal with her abusive Lucis and terrorized people with her. While Terezi matures over the course of the comic into a character in her own right, in so doing she outgrows Vriska, who refuses to change for the longest time. Even when Vriska is resurrected via retcon, Terezi's relationship with her is short-lived, because Vriska is still hung up on being the protagonist, leaving Terezi to figure out who she wants to be in Homestuck Squared. Many people were upset with John bringing Vriska back to life, arguing that it undid her character development from the years she spent dead. And the thing is, those people are right. John, at the behest of Terezi, made a decision to bring back the trump card they needed to win, but it came at the cost of Vriska's character development. She had moved on, for better or worse. The new version of Vriska who survives never learns to do that, so much so that she viciously bullies the version of herself who moved on, and probably the most visceral example of self-loathing in the entire comic. This Vriska continues to be a problem, seeking to regain her plot relevance in Homestuck Squared, but at least the dead Vriska got to finally reunite with Terezi in the afterlife and just be happy. Carapacians. The Carapacians are plot devices as a species, being game abstractions of chess pieces as people. This is why they're almost exclusively called by their roles in society, whether monarchs, bureaucrats, or revolutionaries. The kingdoms of Prospet and Durst do have some notable cultural differences, however. Instead of simply having the good and bad kingdoms, there's some nuance. Prospet is fatalistic, as the odds of victory for them are nearly zero, and yet they fight on anyway. Durst is cynical and tyrannical, both rejecting and loathing religious symbolism. The Black Queen is almost a tragic figure, having to watch the home while her husband wages a war of conquest, regardless of what she wants or believes. Then there's Jack Noir, the only Carapacian with a proper name, for he seeks to rise above his people. As the Archagent, he's basically like the director of the CIA or a military general. He's opportunistic and selfish, but honestly, I had hoped we could see a humbled version of the character. I had thought that Spade Slick might have been that version, as the only Jack to ever be exiled and create things. But unfortunately, he got himself killed, and we never got to see Jack expand as a character. Cherubs. I'll be brief on the Cherubs, as I've already discussed them in the themes section. To summarize, Calliope represents everything lovely about the fandom, and Caliborn represents everything horrible. While the Cherub duality is initially portrayed as good versus evil, the alternate Calliope does away with this notion, asserting that Caliborn was not fated to be the way he was. Considering how the multiple identities in one body has implications for plural people, I think this was a good caveat to add. Critiques. Children. Up to this point, I've been largely praising and gushing about Homestuck. I won't apologize for that. It's good, actually. However, I have offered criticisms here and there, so hopefully you'll understand that I'm not blind to its failings or imperfections. Likewise, I have some larger critiques of the work as a whole I'd like to share, as my analysis wouldn't be complete without it. My first critique directly goes against the first thing I mentioned, the coming of age, and that's that I feel Homestuck's use of children is ultimately a disservice to the narrative. While I explained earlier how and why kids resonated with Homestuck, I think the problems that come from using children as the protagonists in this kind of story outweigh any thematic resonance. I don't think this is true only of Homestuck for what it's worth. A lot of modern media, including comics and anime, use kids as what I feel is a crutch to be relatable to a lucrative demographic. I don't think the themes around freedom or coming of age need characters to be children. People change throughout their lives, and often people only really mature after they are thrown into adulthood, though that's largely a problem for educational systems failing to adequately prepare people for the real world. In my opinion, a coming-of-age story where a character has to learn their place in the world loses very little by aging the characters up to adults. In fact, for queer people, this is more common than not, as many of us have to grow up all over again after deprogramming from being the cult-like mini-me's that our parents tried to force us to be. Homestuck, with an adult protagonist growing up and discovering their queerness in complicated parental relationships, could have been just as fulfilling. So, let's get to the problems that arise from the use of children. I spoke about how Homestuck had kids cursing and discussing adult subjects like real kids do, and I stand by that, but it's important to recognize that this can quickly become both uncomfortable and limiting. The epilogues in Homestuck Squared are only finally able to discuss matters of sex plainly because by that point the characters are adults. And prior to that, there always needed to be care and reservation, something Homestuck didn't consistently do. It just results in fans having to be careful in the ways they discuss and depict the characters in romantic ships. And unfortunately, many fans are not nearly so careful. Like anime, there has been a problem with some of the fandom sexualizing the underage characters. Sometimes they'd be aged up, but other times, it felt like they were given a pass because many of the fans were themselves underage. To be clear, nothing in Homestuck actually endorses rape or pedocrap. I'll make the same prescription I do with anime. Don't make the central characters of your story underage if you intend to engage with sexual topics unless absolutely necessary. And I don't think it was. What was more objectionable, however, was Hussey's fondness for Vriska. See, the idea is that the community, while arguing about Vriska, would often accuse Hussey of being partial to this specific character that made them keep bringing Vriska back into the narrative time after time. So the joke in the comic is that Hussey meets Vriska in the afterlife and is literally in love with her. But if you know nothing of the preceding history, this just comes off as a self-indulgent author literally fawning over a child character they created. It's gross. There's supposed to be some ambiguity because they're both in the afterlife, which is sort of timeless in a nebulous way. But that defense implies it's fine because she's lived millions of years in the afterlife despite still having the body of a 13-year-old. It's not fine, and we don't need some bad jokes that utilize fantasy pedo loopholes. Homestuck does eventually acknowledge this, because when Vriska starts dating Mina, it's a 13-year-old dating a 19-year-old, which is certainly yikes. But when an alternate 16-year-old Vriska takes her place, part of why Mina goes along with it is the lesser age gap. it at least owns up to the problem while deferring the pedo behavior to the character of Mina. But honestly, it's still really problematic and just another thing that didn't need to happen. Irony. Homestuck, particularly earlier in its run, relies on irony as a shield against criticism. Undoubtedly, a portion of people who watch this video will leave comments rebuking my criticisms or rejecting my praises by claiming that Homestuck didn't actually mean any of this, that it was ironic. And they wouldn't be the first. Even artists who helped Hussey have gone on the record as thinking a lot of the comic was ironic. But then the comic kept happening. The comic engages in meta-irony about as often as it uses irony, affecting the appearance of irony while actually being fully sincere. The goal, of course, is to make it dodgy. Anything might be sincere or a joke. Which is up to you. Of course, I reject this framework entirely, and when you look at the whole thing as a piece of art and think about how Hussey dedicated a third of their life to this story, I feel the only legitimate interpretation is that all of it is sincere, even when it's joking. It's just afraid to be recognized as such sometimes. Hussey ironically likes Vriska, but Hussey also just likes Vriska. Dave ironically likes Obama, but Dave also just likes Obama. I think the early irony is best exemplified in Dave's Sweet Bro and Jeff comics that serve to poke fun at the crappy MSPA art style. It just feels cheap to me, in part because I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with the MSPA art style. It's simplistic, vibrant, aliased, and nice. It's a choice, and I'm not gonna ever hate on an art style for being a bold choice. This irony thing undermines it, especially once Dave's comics start being prophetic around Act 5. Fortunately, the comic and Hussey seem to become aware of this. While Hussey would never really stop being an insufferable troll, Dave's irony is soon replaced by Dirk's irony, which would define the character's internal struggles and, eventually, hegemonic villainy. Homestuck's post-canon content recognizes irony for the smokescreen that it is, and has it be the tool of the antagonist. The R-word! One issue that's considered a deal-breaker for a lot of the left these days is that Homestuck makes prolific use of the R-word, a slur for dumb people, originally mentally disabled people, throughout the original comic. It does trail off towards the end of Act 6, but it is prevalent. So, look, I won't defend the R-word, but I'm not going to act like terminology and word use supersedes action. A lot of leftists and liberals act like people are either secretly bigots or secretly pure, and it's only through analyzing word choice, like a polygraph test, that you can suss out the bad ones. And that's just not how politics or prejudice work. Language is complicated and messy, and it evolves. I ultimately think it was a mistake for Homestuck to use this word so much, as it certainly alienated a lot of people. But I do believe that choosing to deny the artistic, political, or progressive values of any piece of work or individual person for using such a word alone is counterproductive to progress and forging alliances, as well as just limiting for your personal experiences, especially as words continue to evolve and change. But I totally understand if this is just not something you want to personally hear. Aracial. Everyone's gonna love this section, but we shan't omit Homestuck's problematic attitude towards race. When Hussey started the comic, they made a decision to have all of the humans depicted race-neutrally, as a literal stark white. This matched the white backdrop of John's home, but this choice has remained firmly in place throughout the entirety of Homestuck, even as it evolved into something much larger. I understand that changing the depiction of race partway through would have likely been strange, but I believe there have been negative racial implications from this race neutrality in both the comic and the community. So, first of all, most of us can agree that diversity is good, right? It's good to have characters of a multitude of races, among other kinds of backgrounds, in fiction. It helps normalize people from being othered. Can we agree that this race neutrality is not that? It does not give representation. At best, it's an attempt to duck the question, to remove oneself from racial politics. But any progressive should know that that's not possible. We are all entrenched in bias. None of us exist in a vacuum. The only other place to look for racial representation are the real people that make cameos in the comic. The only among them who are people of color are Barack Obama, Bill Cosby, Charles Barkley, Charles Dutton, Donald Glover, and Troll Will Smith. It's nice to see important black men represented. Most of us didn't know about Cosby at the time. But clearly Homestuck could have done more. So if this race neutrality is not representation, what is it? I believe it really just serves to lampshade just how white and not diverse that Homestuck is in terms of race. It's not offensive, but it implies that the only distinguishing characteristic of race is skin color, in a way evocative of liberal colorblindness. John could be any race, he just happens to have a nana into old-timey music, a successful businessman dad, and a suburban home in the middle of Washington state. Come on. Knowing the real-world impacts of slavery, segregation, and redlining, what race would someone in that situation most likely be? This is what's called racial coding, and John is white-coded. Much like how the majority of Disney villains are queer-coded, the majority of characters in Homestuck are white-coded. There's an infamous phrase of pink monkeys that's used on multiple occasions to describe humans, and while this phrase does not literally mean the characters are white, it's pretty obvious the coding implications of the phrase in regards to a light skin tone and is indicative of authorial bias. There are some exceptions, like how the Ares trolls are all Japanese coded, with Damara specifically just being a race of caricature, or how the Condesce just so happens to speak in a manner consistent with AAVE. This race neutrality has also had a negative impact on the community. Trickster mode is a silly, goofy idea that reached prominence in Act 6, where the humans temporarily gain ridiculous candy-themed love powers. Trickster mode is also the only time where the race neutrality disappears, as suddenly all of the characters become white, like Caucasian white. Again, another poor, edgy joke meant to make fun of the racist who deemed it necessary that they all be actually white. The community was extremely offended, in part because it drew attention to Homestuck's failings in racial politics, but also because it dared to make a statement on people's precious racial headcanons. There's a thing online loosely called shipping culture, where fans set up imaginary ships, pairing fictional characters off with each other. And there's a contingent of people, not all of them, who balk at criticism that some ships might be problematic in various ways due to incest, abuse, power dynamics, or just any reason, really. This behavior is problematic because it seeks to elude criticism. If one were to pair Rose with a man instead of a woman, I might criticize that pairing on the grounds that that pairing seems to erase her gayness. And if that person responded by saying my criticism was invalid because it was their headcanon or just a silly thing, that person would be asserting that what they choose to do with fiction is beyond reproach, and that is silly. Homestuck's depiction of characters as aracial has fed into that mentality, that headcanons are as sacred and unassailable as sexual preference. So what inevitably happens if you try to address, let alone criticize, how Homestuck or its community handles race, is that you will be called racist, regardless of what you actually said. And yes, I would know because they did this to my partner and I. Look, I support fanfiction, and am a proponent for death of the author. If you want to make your own versions of things, go right ahead. But I'm sick of people in our community that refuse to make room to even discuss the racial politics within Homestuck. It's literally racist, and I expected better. And all the woke skulls already typing up their hateful comments, my partner Kira says she backs me 100% on these takes. I don't think one's race intrinsically makes their takes good or bad, but If you're the kind of person who does, please forward your complaints to the Latina woman. Yiffy. The problems with the character of Yiffy, Jade and Rose's child in Homestuck Squared, should be fairly evident. She was originally going to be named Ruby, which would have been so much better, but Hussey insisted that she be named Yiffy with the nickname Yiffy. They thought it was so funny. It's not. If you aren't aware, Yiffy is a term within the furry community that effectively translates to being sexually aroused. This is supposed to be a joke, because Yiffy is part furry, having inherited dog traits from Jade. It's particularly crass because sexualization is a controversial issue in the furry community, with many saying they don't want to be defined by the lewdest among them, but also with many saying that such a queer-adjacent community is naturally going to be more sexually liberated. Yiffy manages to anger both of these groups, along with people just looking for an excuse to hate furries, by the simple fact that she is an underage character named after a sexual term. Yet another character who would have been better off had she been an adult. The most frustrating thing about Yiffy was the bonus story that was released, where Hussey makes a guest appearance, as they had stepped away from Homestuck by that point, and talks with Dirk about the controversy with her. In this conversation, Hussey doesn't take any criticism, and basically just trolls Dirk. And I thought we were beyond this point by now? Do we have to be this edgy and irreverent still? Maybe having a sexually named teenage kid could be a bad idea? Bizarrely, Hussey even defends Caliborn of all characters in this exchange, leading me to think they weren't really trying to be sincere here. When complaining about her to my friends, I said it'd be like naming a child character Boobs and then trying to take that seriously. And then they all laughed, which I guess undermines my point. I was hoping that as Homestuck Squared went on, that we could learn more about Yiffy, that could at least make the character more well-rounded and justified. Sadly, that's not going to happen. Real people. My last critique is that I really think the way Homestuck handles real people in its narrative can be revisionist at best, and outright offensive at worst. I've already talked about how the Skynet logs were atrocious with this, but the rest of Homestuck doesn't escape unscathed. While celebrities and historical figures are mentioned in the early acts, they were just used as cultural touchstones, never actually appearing in the flesh or affecting the narrative. This changes. Barack Obama specifically has a weirdly glorifying appearance in the epilogues that I feel is in pretty bad taste given his very mixed history as president. I understand that Obama's campaigns were among the first to reach the younger generations, and that his existence was a meme, but I just don't feel that excuses any of this. It's even implied that he was gay for Dirk, and thus bisexual, and I think revising a real person's sexuality from something other than what it really was to be pretty gross. I'm a fan of the Hamilton musical, so I can't simply say not to reinterpret historical figures or I'd be a hypocrite. So what I'll say is I think it's fine to have historical figures and celebrities in your fiction, but you should generally make an effort to depict them as they are or were. Even if you have aliens in your story, have the real person respond how you suspect they might respond. Doctor Who does this all the time, and I think generally they do fine. What you don't want to do is rewrite entire character traits, or if you do, you need to do so with care and respect. Hamilton race bends the founding fathers, but never to disrespect them, and the musical has a purpose in that premise. Obama being gay, what does that add? In my eyes, only a false representation for the sake of a bad joke. However, the folks done most dirty by Homestuck's revisionism are Guy Fieri and the Insane Clown Posse. Juggalo culture appears within troll culture, and here it's usually portrayed in a negative light, mocking it for being anti-science and parodying it as the predominant religion of Alternia. That's harsh enough, but Homestuck goes even further, saying ICP in the B2 timeline eventually became fascist presidents of the United States as figureheads on behalf of the Condes. Whatever criticisms you might have of ICP, claiming they would bring about the rise of fascism and herald the end of humanity is borderline slander. And Guy Fieri's portrayal is even worse. Guy Fieri was an eccentric celebrity chef around in the early 2010s, but he quickly became almost universally reviled in pop culture after a critic publicly mocked his restaurant's flashy, indulgent style. Hussey capitalized on that resentment by writing that, in the B2 timeline, Fieri becomes a Supreme Court justice, the High Chaplain of Interstellar War, and even the third Antichrist, who commits the Hilarocost, an offensive, bad joke version of the Holocaust that indiscriminately genocides 5 billion people. Since then, in the real world, pop culture has been much kinder to Fieri, with his image being rehabilitated, with people realizing that being flashy and indulgent doesn't automatically make you an evil psychopath. Of all people, you'd think Hussey might understand that. Perhaps now they do. Fieri's politics seem to be progressive, with him being overtly pro-LGBT, even officiating a mass gay wedding after its legalization. But honestly, even if he was a horrible person, his depiction in Homestuck as a genocidal fascist would maybe still be slanderous. At best you could argue it's an alternate timeline evil Fieri, but it still just feels extremely mean-spirited and petty. Politics. So now that we've gotten both praise and criticism out of the way, I wanted to take a moment to look at the politics of Homestuck. What are the socio-political implications of Homestuck as a series of art? Thinking about it, I've come to the conclusion that Homestuck has 4 discrete political messages to its reader. The first and most obvious is that Homestuck is progressive. I've already explained how and why in the queer culture section. Basically, as its creators and fanbase became gayer, so did the comic. Simple enough. Homestuck is also anti-fascist. You'll probably have noticed that I used the word fascist numerous times in both the recap and analysis so far, and there's good reason for it. Almost every bad guy in Homestuck is either an opportunist or some kind of fascist. I don't think Hussey was trying to make some grand statement about Nazis being bad. I just think when they were depicting Troll Society as alien and despotic as possible, they gravitated towards the most evil form of government known, fascism. Putting a matriarch as the head was but another alien twist to how patriarchal fascism tends to be. But honestly, it worked. It was a deliberate decision to keep her imperious condescension alive to the end. To have the fascist empress, who separated her people into blood castes, enslaved whole populations, and committed genocides, be the only ancestor to survive and become an antagonist. She makes a compelling villain, and through her we see that all of the barbaric practices of troll culture weren't endemic to their species, but rather the result of a specific political framework. Since the Condess is behind most of the fascism in the story, it could be easy to just see her as a one-off tyrant in the liberal fashion to rebuke systems for the sake of specific individuals. But the epilogues in Homestuck Squared do much to show us that this is not the case. The Condess was said to both groom and murder heiresses, implying a conflict between wanting a legacy and wanting immortality. Pfeffery only achieved that in an alternate timeline, and Highswap shows us a troll named Trizza who briefly rose to prominence. However, throughout Act 6, we see attempts by the Condess to groom a human, Jane. Unfortunately, Jane makes that reduction, pinning everything bad on the Condess herself, and not the ideas she stood for. She becomes the very embodiment of the Condess's legacy, enforcing policies of supremacy that the Condess would have found deliciously ironic. With Jane, Homestuck shows us that it's not enough to kill the figurehead of fascism. You must kill the idea. Homestuck is also anti-theist. This is honestly not one I was expecting, but as I made this analysis, I just couldn't escape it. Homestuck doesn't speak of any human religion almost ever, beyond the mentioning of Jesus a few times, but that doesn't mean there isn't some heavy criticism of religion and nuanced takes on faith. The most obvious critique of religion is in the form of the Trolls' Juggalo religion, which serves to replace what we see as the stuffy mundanity of Abrahamic faith with a goofier, more whimsical alternative. The actual beliefs are somewhat innocuous, believing that the mirthful Messiah shall one day take us back to the Paradise Planet. And because it's Homestuck, there's a paradoxical kernel of truth to this fate. However, it's what is done in the name of this religion that is truly abhorrent. Only the Purple Bloods are shown worshipping it, because due to the caste system, they stand to benefit from it the most. In Kurlos' universe, this religion is esoteric, leaning into the idea that the troll timeline was better in a world where this religion wasn't prominent. Gamzee, however, is an avid believer, much to the dumbfounded amusement of his comrades. It's only when he is provided evidence that contradicts his religion that he snaps and starts killing people. Gamzee often depicts the mirthful messiahs with a smile and frown, indicative of theater mass, and the implication is that the religion is two-faced. But perhaps it represents how religion is a tool that can be used for good or for ill. This moral binary is made evident by Gamzee's adopted children, Calliope and Caliborn, and Gamzee's insistence that he himself could be both motherfucking messiahs is reflected in how the Grand High Blood literally occupied both of the dual patriarchal positions that would later be taken up by the two members of ICP. Gamzee takes that position himself on Earthsea until Empress Jane decides both he and religion have outlived their usefulness, not unlike how fascists have historically employed religious fervor only to dispose of it later. So, while there is some nuance, it seems that Homestuck is extremely critical of the orthodoxy of religion at the very least, with every troll advocate being a villain. But there is another religion in Homestuck. In every game session, the Carapacians of Prospit and Durst have strong beliefs regarding Skya and the Genesis Frog, but they disagree on it. Durst is meant to be the evil kingdom, but they have more depth than that. They know that the frog can be made, and so they oppose Skya and Prospit because they don't want it to exist. It's like they're meant to be reactionary atheists trying to prevent the possibility of being proven wrong. So whereas Troll Society was criticized for using religion to oppress, we see Durst using a dogmatic version of atheism to oppress as well. Even the symbol of a frog is considered contraband, for it represents possibilities they do not want. Prospit, on the other hand, adores the possibility of the frog, and for their god to be made manifest. But the tragic thing is that every iteration of Prospit knows that it is almost impossible for them to succeed at the incredible odds against them. Their entire culture is built around a doomed faith. They're not a doomsday cult like some real-world religions. They specifically believe it is the players who can change the odds in their favor. And I can't help but read this as a message that, while orthodoxy is often used to oppress, a sense of faith or just hope might be worthwhile. But specifically a faith in heroes, physical, real people, to make that utopia come to reality. There's an interplay of secularity and faith here where I feel that Homestuck is basically saying that the only real faith we should have is that of people. Believe in each other to make the reality we want to see. And Durst can't do that because that faith upsets their status quo. Hi, Future Kyle here. I realized there was an obvious counter-argument many are likely to make that I wanted to address. Specifically, that Homestuck is actually quite pro-theist, as evidenced by the use of allusions to Christianity. I've already mentioned how the Signless is basically Troll Jesus, and the Dolorosa is a clear reference to the Virgin Mary. The Signless even has powers, preaches about good things, and dies a martyr. However, I feel this analysis to be superficial, as the Signless is neither God nor an emissary of God, but rather, he is an activist for equality. I believe the allusion to Jesus here is as a historical martyr, i.e., Jesus the man, as opposed to a divine figure. Naturally, there is still an implication of faith, as the Signless would have a literal cult following, but considering that the Juggalo pagans largely succeeded in stamping out faith in the Signless, and that the Signless was not unique in having magic powers, I really don't think Homestuck was implicitly endorsing Christianity, nor even any sort of one true god. And that's why I focus on the more predominant Juggalo religion instead. Anyway, back to past Kyle. Lastly, Homestuck is also anti-xenophobia. This one might sound obvious, but what I mean is that Homestuck has a specific message about racialized bigotry across species, effectively a sort of ultra anti-racism. Homestuck has certainly been edgy and irreverent about racial politics, but the epilogues and Homestuck Squared take it a step further, a step that I think was telegraphed throughout the original comic. In the comic, there's a lot of interaction between humans and trolls, along with some other species, and the concept of multicultural exchange is brought up frequently. Interspecies relationships occur. The epilogues in Homestuck Squared explore these ideas on a societal level with what I think is a straightforward thesis. Even if people of different races were physically and biologically different, racism would still be wrong. On Earthsea, humans, trolls, Carapacians, and consorts all live under a single government. They are all people, but they are different species. Trolls can have psychic powers and live a while. Carapacians also live a while, but can only reproduce by cloning. Consorts are short-lived but reproduce quickly and still seem to have full lives. Trolls are hamstringed from reproduction, have to engage in Carapacian cloning, and it's only upon regaining the mother grub and reproducing their own way that human supremacists start to see them as a threat. Even that concept, human supremacy, is kind of astounding to me. Like, of course we would have people that think like that in a post-First Contact world, right? It's rare we get to see stories actually address speciesism like this, and I think it's very valuable. We get so caught up fighting against racism in the real world that I think it's important to recognize that even if the racists were right, they'd still be wrong. Karkat is factually a mutant-blooded troll with no powers and who probably won't live much past 40 years old. But he's deserving of as much rights as anyone else. I also feel the racial allegories to the fight against xenophobia on Earthsea are well done. The consorts are said to not only be underrepresented in government, but also so gerrymandered that their votes have been reduced in power. Carapacians have a pro-monarchist movement as a response to Jane's rise to power in a sort of, if we're gonna have a dictator, it should at least be our girl manner. The trolls have a whole revolution to fight for their right to exist. There is a strange detail in the Candy timeline where every ghost that survived the battle with Lord English falls to Earthsea as a sort of spectral immigrant. The influx of this ghost troll immigration is seen as a threat to the human supremacists, but we don't ever really get to see the impact of this on society, which I think is a shame. I like the analogy to immigration, but we don't even understand how ghost physiology would work in this context. Is it basically a second chance at life? And wouldn't it be a bit disturbing to have thousands of immigrants that are not just trolls, but specifically alternate timeline versions of powerful beings in your history books? Is the government, or at least the Troll Rebellion, going to have an Alt-Vriska rehabilitation program? We don't know. Legacy. When I started writing this essay, I had mentioned that I would focus on the art, the text, the comic of Homestuck itself, whereas most people who review it only discuss the fandom, community, and drama around it. While this frustrates me, unfortunately, a discussion of Homestuck isn't really complete without discussing its legacy on popular culture, particularly online. So, here goes. A popular narrative around Homestuck has been established, one I hope to undermine. The idea is that Homestuck was a big, shameful thing of the internet's past, like contemporary comics like Control-Alt-Delete, something that we have to reluctantly acknowledge but shamefully hide in the back, and certainly never promote. Homestuck can only be analyzed clinically, post-mortem, like a patient we all once knew, etherized upon an autopsy table. We'll acknowledge that Homestuck was once huge, when it was kinda good in Act 5, but since then it has thankfully dropped off in popularity to go into the dustbin of online engagement. Only still loved in the modern day by weirdos, freaks, and degenerates. And not only have the creators of Homestuck, namely Hussey, committed the crime of continuing to make more Homestuck content, they have also stolen millions and ruined people's lives. This narrative is at worst inaccurate and at best reductive, and it is this narrative I want to squash if I'm able. I won't mince words, I believe Homestuck is one of the most maligned pieces of popular art by people online. And no, it's not a persecution complex or any crap like that. There's a reason I say this about Homestuck, and not like Fallout or Pokemon or any of my other interests. If you bring up Homestuck to a stranger online, the only responses of recognition you'll often receive will be of concern, if not outright hostility. Many Homestuck communities have had to become enclaves to find peace, meaning that the people around my age, especially in progressive spaces, are often former or closeted Homestuck fans that just don't talk about it openly. There's even a number of high-profile leftists that have definitely read Homestuck and have opinions on it, but you don't normally hear about it because it's a divisive thing to bring up. The only two leftist content creators I've known to bring up Homestuck outside of a Homestuck takedown video are, first, video essayist H. Bomber Guy, who says,
Toby Fox himself has a history of making fun of dumb aspects of fandoms, even going so far as to compose the parody Homestuck rock opera The Baby Is You, about a character somehow giving birth to their best friend to satire the bizarre limits of weird Homestuck fanfiction.
Here, H. Bomber Guy is one of the few to even link the extremely popular game of Undertale to one of its primary inspirations, Homestuck, and he does it in a way that is simultaneously charitable and condemning. The other is streamer Vosh, who says,
I've read Homestuck twice. That's enough for me. Just one of them is a huge endeavor to begin with.
And it makes sense that someone as already maligned among the left as he wouldn't hesitate to even gently associate himself with Homestuck, unlike many others. So, why is Homestuck so maligned? As with a lot of the internet, we have to go back to Gamergate. The general political bias of the English-speaking internet tends to wax and wane with a myriad of factors, and these can be categorized, though they tend to only be recognized by the majority in retrospect. These factors can be national elections, government regulations, general culture shifts, algorithmic alterations, societal education, technological advancement, and many other things. Gamergate was a shift around 2014 where ethics in games journalism was used as a veil to cover for harassment campaigns against women and basically anyone the right wing didn't like. And it would eventually lead into a post-Trump election era, but Gamergate didn't come out of nowhere. It was a culmination of shifts in policies before it, most notably YouTube having a positive feedback loop towards extremist right-wing content in its algorithm. I bring this up to say that while Homestuck began in 2009 with a bunch of kids and programmers, by 2012, Act 6 was rolling out at a time where people were increasingly being radicalized to the right and bolstering a new wave of neo-Nazis. Where was Homestuck during this? Well, it wasn't with what would become Gamergate. Homestuck had already made its place within Tumblr culture, which was effectively, diametrically opposed to YouTube at the time, as a relatively safe haven for queer people. The effects of Gamergate on Homestuck aren't invisible. They definitely rear their head with its ancestors, but for the most part, Homestuck didn't jump on the bigoted bandwagon, and I think this is notable. Homestuck was on a decline since its peak in Act 5, but I'd wager that many of the fans they bled first were the reactionary ones. It wasn't uncommon for right-wing Homestuck fans to say that you should stop reading after Act 5, despite Act 6 constituting about a third of the comic. In 2012, a Kickstarter to create a Homestuck video game garnered over $2 million in crowdfunding, and the creative team behind Homestuck coalesced into What Pumpkin Studios, with Hussey at the lead. This game would eventually become Hiveswap, but developing news began to drag on and become quieter and quieter. I admit that to this day, I don't think Hiveswap will ever be finished, and many haters of Homestuck have gone through great efforts to document every bit of drama in the development process to ultimately make the claim that What Pumpkin maliciously wasted their donors' money. You'll notice that righteous admonitions for wasting donated Kickstarter money was the same tactic done to Anita Sarkeesian, one of the central feminists harassed by Gamergate. I know Kickstarter tells people that they are supposed to honor the crowdfunding and do what they claim to do with the donations, but I think it obvious that such provisions are really just meant to discourage scamming, not honest, genuine financial incompetence. $2 million is simply not a lot of money to make a game. Yes, games have been made on less, but they're often made on more, even by indie standards. Games are really hard to make. I don't have any loyalty to What Pumpkin. They're a media corporation, who cares? I've seen evidence they've done some genuinely shady stuff, as well as being too quick to be litigious, which I do think is hypocritical given the liberal interpretation of fair use by Homestuck. And Hussey is an outright troll. But I believe most people donate to crowdfunding knowing that it's a speculative investment that may not pan out. The people cry bullying about stolen money from underdelivered results are often not the people who actually donated. Going after the Kickstarters is an attempt to legitimize a campaign of hatred you already wanted. Where did the money go? Probably in the drain, to be honest. Overhead for staff making something that barely came to pass. Hussey looks to me to be a pretty incompetent manager, and I think it says something unfortunate that so many are quick to jump to malice as an explanation, despite company incompetence being such a commonplace phenomenon. It's important to not confuse Hussey with What Pumpkin. While the two were synonymous for a time, they no longer oversee the company. The reason for this is fairly obvious. For the first couple years of the comic, Hussey was drawing panels, writing text, and animating flashes at a breakneck pace, often even doing it daily. I genuinely think his workload was comparable to Japanese mangaka in just the sheer amount of labor being done to make a comic, though of course Hussey's torment was more self-inflicted. Naturally, this would lead to burnout that resulted in many large pauses in production. While they had often sought to incorporate work from community contributors, they began to rely on it more and more, and the pauses got longer, most infamously with the Gigapause and Omegapause. These pauses often coincided with Hiveswap news going dark. I want to be clear, I don't begrudge these pauses. Did they kill momentum for the fandom? Not entirely, but they definitely helped. But I also understand what it's like to just hit rock bottom with burnout. And I won't ever begrudge a creative for taking the time they need to recover. Although I will admit, it seems to have taken its toll not just on Hussey, but also any of his team has struggled to keep up with him. So as the authors of the comic became more and more elusive, what did the community do? Well, the community did what it always did best. They made fan projects. I just want to highlight how creative and motivated the Homestuck fandom was, from early on and even well into its conclusion. There were fantastic animated projects, like Rex Duodecim Angulus, which showed the trolls battling their eldritch Black King, or After Us, which detailed the history of the ancestors in one cinematic. There were dubs, most famously of which was Voxus, formerly called Clolab, which created Let's Read Homestuck. I'll be honest, If you got this far and are still unsure about reading Homestuck, watch the dub. It has a rocky start, but I sincerely believe the dub massively improves on the source material with phenomenal editing and voice acting.
Hello, ladies.
What? This is a private conversation. Private even to those who know it word for word already.
Proceed.
And there were also fan songs like Broadway Car Cat.
Look at this felt suit and the tie around your neck. You're a poser for sure, and it ain't cool.
And Total Spiffage.
Oh, baby, come and so who cares about a little me? Oh no, oh no, oh no.
And so much fan fiction, with a whole website to just host Homestuck fan adventures. So let's now focus on the backlash, as reactionaries from both within and without the Homestuck fandom made hating it their passion. Much like the stereotypical gamer, the anti-fan wears their passion for a piece of media as a badge of honor, with the expressed goal to deny the criticism of others who do not wear this badge. This is why a lot of anti-fans will claim to have once been Homestuck fans. While they may well have been, their badge is unassailable, and retorting that you too have such a badge must be interrogated. Notice, by the way, how when the Epilogues and later Homestuck Squared was released, these anti-fans, by and large, shifted from Homestuck was good before Act 6 to Homestuck was good before the Epilogues. Like many reactionaries, they throw a fit every time history moves forward and simultaneously claim to have been on board until just recently. Obviously, I don't have any hard numbers on this. I'm just a person telling you my experiences and saying how I see things, and how I believe a lot of modern-day maligned Homestucks see things. Of course, though, I will explain this from a left-wing perspective, which will ensure everyone hates me, even the left. When I think of who Homestuck's fanbase has been over the past decade or so politically, I think it shakes out like this. At first, you could divide the fans into three categories. First, you had reactionaries, people who enjoyed Homestuck but would freak out if they heard any buzzwords they at the time called SJW, now called woke. This group was on board but would have to actively be pandered towards lest they jump ship, while projecting everyone else was pandering. There were also the liberals, people who had been born and raised in a relatively agreeable mindset when it came to social issues. These people would have always been on board with progressive themes, making the queering of Homestuck likely a happy surprise for them. The last group were, well, okay, they were just a bunch of dumb kids that didn't really have much of an ideology. Impressionable, they could have ended up as anything. And relevantly, they were consuming Homestuck. The queerification of Homestuck would thus tend to result in the queerification of these dummies. And I say that with love, as I was one of them. Over time, things would shift and people would grow. After the conclusion of Homestuck and Homestuck Squared as well, I believe things shake out like this now. The reactionaries, by and large, wouldn't stick around and morphed into anti-fans, people who are fans of media only to hate on it, whether it be My Little Pony, Steven Universe, or even Disney's Frozen. Basically Caliborns. You can usually recognize them by how they complain about characters being or becoming woke. Meanwhile, both the dummies and liberals would see transformation towards becoming the left, i.e. progressives, whether liberal or leftist. Whether it's because they were morally lucky and had been instilled with progressive values from a young age, or because Homestuck or other life events had gradually helped them evolve into caring people, a significant chunk of Homestuck's fandom and former fandom have been in the left. However, the left is not a monolith, and when it comes to progressive values, there is a large schism, and Homestuck's community has not been immune to it. See, on the left, we're often forced to reckon with a nebulous group of people, usually white, who weaponize identity politics and progressive rhetoric towards abusive ends. There isn't really a set term for them. Some call them tender queers, but woke scold has increasingly become reclaimed from the right to refer to this group of bad faith faux progressives. Woke scolds often pretend to be leftists with just a focus on progressivism, but their claimed politics never match their actions. The woke skull knows they are powerless against the right, and so seeks to make themselves powerful against anyone else. As sci-fi author Lindsay Ellis once said,
"Why are you wasting so much energy on this? Because you can't impact people who are actually doing your community harm. You can't shame the shameless. Trump will never face justice. Brett Kavanaugh's on the Supreme Court for life. Ben Shapiro gets off on your outrage. So you shame those who can be shamed."
So, by the time the epilogues came out, a two-front campaign of bigotry began to narrow in on Homestuck. But when Hussey ceased writing and let another team at What Pumpkin take the reins for Homestuck Squared, this two-faced campaign was cranked up significantly. Not only were right-wing anti-fans sending death threats and harassment to the writers of Homestuck Squared and their defenders for it being too progressive, but they also had to deal with woke skulls claiming to be the left, harassing them for making work that was actually really problematic, homophobic, and transphobic. Too woke, and not woke enough. They felt trapped, and the two-faced harassment campaign worked. Homestuck Squared was put on indefinite hiatus. It was over. It often goes unsaid that the team creating Homestuck Squared was mostly queer, and consisted of both gay and trans folks. So, anytime I see someone discussing the legacy of Homestuck, talking about the toxicity of the community, or making a takedown video of the comic and fandom, and they don't mention how it all came crashing down, how the artists and writers have been the targets of bigoted harassment, they're being duplicitous by omission. And that's complicity as far as I'm concerned. Hate Homestuck if you want, hate What Pumpkin, hate the toxic fans. But know who you side with if you downplay the transphobic bigotry that brought Homestuck Square to its end. Can't help but think of how Hussey had promised to grant a fan's wish, that John would eventually transition into June. And I think of how a lot of people really wanted to see that come true in at least one timeline. It seemed like we were leading up to that, perhaps with the Candy timeline. But we probably won't ever get to see that now. Not in any official capacity. And nowadays, most Homestucks are closeted. And that's because of bigots. Both on the right and the supposed left. That's why I use the term woke skull. Woke skulls are bigots that cozy up to the left, but they are not progressive. I don't care what freaking dictionary words they use as they tear down our queer comrades. What matters are not just the words you use, but your actions you do with those words. And these actions are a shame. So, with Homestuck seemingly dead for good, I began work on this video. I also made a survey to see if people agreed or disagreed with me. My sample size was small, only 70 people responded, and the results were mixed, but I found them to be interesting and wanted to share them here. Here's what I found. Question 1 shows who responded, simple enough. 2 and 3 gives us when fans joined the fandom. Apparently most were teenagers at the time. I also found that most respondents were queer in some way, about 3/4 of them. That is huge! Make no mistake about it, Homestuck is a queer piece of media. I asked if the respondents had been bullied within the fandom to compare to bullying without, and the results were split. Some spoke of being attacked for misrepresenting characters, arguing about fan discourse, betrayed by friends, and even groomed. One anonymous respondent elaborated on their experience.
Okay, so I was attacked and had people attempt to dox me because I was framed for running or helping to run a Twitter account that was criticizing a toxic clique that was running the Twitter side of the fandom for years. Some of my friends were also framed, and my ex-wife was harassed for it to the point of attempting suicide. The person who provided the out-of-context Discord screenshot upon which the framing was based had previously been bullied into a total mental breakdown and possible dissociative identity death.
That is tragic, and no Homestuck should ever condone that behavior. Comparing this to bullying from without the fandom, I found more had been than not, ranging from being treated as a freak to more detailed responses like this one.
Yeah, my two friends got pretty mad over me getting excited and talking about Homestuck a lot. For context, I have ADHD, and I'll get hyperfixated on stuff, and my current hyperfixation at the moment is Homestuck. So I didn't exactly realize I was talking about it that much, and it caused a bunch of unnecessary drama and a pretty large fight that easily could have been avoided. Plus, one of my ex-friends kept making it way worse when me and my other friend were basically fine again. Me and the friend who got annoyed with me worked out the issue and we're still good friends. Also, the other person who made the fight worse is no longer friends with me. I still think that it was an unnecessary fight, because I really was just talking about something I like, and it wasn't harming anything. I was just trying to enjoy it.
Comparing the responses, it seems to me that Homestucks were disproportionately bullied from without than within to a frequency that I feel exceeds what you'd expect of a typical fandom. I even found that a majority felt compelled to hide their affinity with Homestuck, like this person.
Homestuck is sort of like my happy place. My username is derived from Homestuck, and I wear my love for the series on my sleeve for other fans to potentially notice. But I am still extremely hesitant to talk about it with anyone at all. While I would love to talk about it for hours on end with everyone I know, Homestuck slander, not constructive criticism, leaves me feeling insecure. It feels as though there's this constant insistence that I am wrong for ascribing sentimental value to the series. And in some capacity, it feels like it's a sort of disparagement of my dignity, and sometimes even intelligence, through the direct invalidation of my standards and ideals. TLDR, I would sing its praises daily, if I weren't constantly guilted out of it.
This seems very abnormal to me. How many fandoms are out there where the respondents are made to feel ashamed to be in them? Homestuck isn't a porn game where the reticence to be associated with it can just as often be self-enforced out of embarrassment. It seems like Homestucks really do want to talk about this thing they love, but something stops them. The last thing I learned was how embittered the respondents were due to unfulfilled promises. 26% did, 43% did at some point, while 27% don't. So this is where the fandom of Homestuck was, after Homestuck Squared was killed, predominantly feeling harassed, ashamed, or bitter. And this is where I thought they would stay. In this video, I wanted to eulogize Homestuck. This was meant to be closure for me, and maybe you'd get something out of this too. I even wrote a whole section where I fanfictioned my own ending. But then, in the more than a year I've been working on this video, something happened. Something I never expected. Homestuck Squared came back to life. Homestuck is back! It's actually back! New pages are being made. There's a new team making it, led by notorious Homestuck musician James Roach. We're seeing progress on the Candy and Meat storylines. We're getting to see what's going to happen to the creator children, who are now dubbed the Omega Kids. Clever. And the comic is now called... What? They dropped the 2? I am not re-recording this whole thing. Besides, I like the Squared. Felt like something Dirk came up with. The team behind it, now called the Homestuck Independent Creative Union, a separate entity from What Pumpkin or Viz, seems to be trying really hard to be more transparent. And that's definitely a good thing. To be honest though, this desire to be in constant communication with the fandom has me a bit worried the direction of the story is going to lean towards pleasing fan expectations instead of being something that is meant to challenge its readers like Homestuck had always been. I'm sure they have good intentions, but will this team honestly do something as radical as change the gender of one of its esteemed characters? Will they risk stirring up the hate mobs just to bring June into existence? I worry there will be an incentive to reject such things unless they get audience approval, especially as someone who liked where Homestuck Squared was going. Also, it feels like there was an intention to redesign some of the Homestuck Squared character designs that I definitely question. I really liked Terezi's old look and how it suited her goofy taste. I have to admit that Rosebud's redesign is kind of funny though. I just imagine her delicately taking her crown of thorns off, putting the hood down, and then definitely putting it back on. And speaking of Rose, I felt it was a strange choice to have Candy Rose act like a heartless future sight automaton when that role was already occupied by Rosebot. But maybe that will pay off later. That's not to say I won't be excited to see where the comic does go. I really liked how Kanaya confronted Rose and Jade about their duplicity in a way that legitimately went a long way towards justifying Yiffy's existence. Jade wanted a child to fill a hole in her life. Vriska's Dream Quest is possibly the best thing to come out of the Beyond Canon content. It's basically a deep psychological dive into the most controversial and interesting character in all of Homestuck. Seeing the damage from Doc Scratch was particularly chilling. Clearly a HSBC writer knew a thing or two about suffering from abuse. And hey, they brought the Sprites back. They also kept the tradition of being really weird about Vriska's age. The epilogues in Homestuck Squared were weirdly ambiguous about her age, but I just figured she must have spent years in the void, aging into an adult like the rest of the cast, including Teresi, who also did that, aged in the void. But HSBC goes, nope, she was still 16 all along and is only now being aged up, which I guess means Gamzee is a pedo? Like, maybe you weren't supposed to read the encounter between Vriska and the mid-30s Gamzee as sexual, but the epilogues specifically state they went beyond a simple kiss, and Gamzee even calls her bootylicious. Whatever, guess Pope Gamzee overtakes Mina in the pedo meta, but at least Vriska is absolutely, definitely an actual adult now like her peers. So, all in all, when HSBC isn't fixated on revisiting its past and instead does its own thing, it's genuinely good. Like the scene where Jake realizes his imaginary Dirk is just a reflection of himself, masterfully captures his grief for Dirk and his unrealized heroism. Oh, and they're even focusing on how alternate Calliope, even in her opposition to the villainous Dirk, is still a flawed narrator in her own right, showing that she seeks to curtail canon, and I really didn't think they'd go there. Also, the HICU is even licensing Homestuck fan comics like Vast Error, making them literally just as canon as Homestuck Squared. That is so cool, and legit in theme with what Beyond Canon is meant to be. I look forward to seeing more. Maybe I'll release the ending I wrote someday, but for now, let's just see where this goes. To tell the truth, I don't know if my weary Homestuck heart can fully believe that they'll actually see it through this time and finish Homestuck. Maybe it'll be just another odd chapter in a history of pauses. But whatever happens, I'm glad to see this wonderful comic getting another chance. For the first time in a very long time, I have to reckon with the possibility that Homestuck will outlive me, and not just in its legacy. This video was supposed to be called Homestuck Was Good, actually. No, I was wrong. It's not Homestuck Was Good, actually. It's Homestuck is good, actually. Not was, it is. As this essay winds to a close, I want to make things personal for a moment. I've explained the merits and flaws of Homestuck as a work of art, and I've talked about its themes, politics, and legacy. But I want to talk about what Homestuck was to me. I wasn't one of the early fans that had been there since Act 1. I only came later and had to catch up, a fairly common experience. But this is why I oppose the idea that a coming-of-age story necessitates having child characters. Because when I was 18, I still had a lot of maturing to do. My biological family is very far right, with both evangelicals and fascists among them. I had a lot of garbage ideas fed into me as a child. But my saving grace was having access to media. There's a number of things I could credit to my growth as a human being. But in particular, I cite Homestuck, which I pored over in college. I had never really questioned what it meant to be gay until I saw the quadrant system. I found the alternate forms of love fascinating, which prompted me to reflect on love in the real world. Fortunately, I had theoretically believed in equality, and so as my eyes opened and I saw the inequality in the world, I shifted towards ideologies I felt better able to address that, though I was confused for a long time. I was on the MSPA forums as I tried to figure myself out. Ironically, my confusion even got me in trouble in the gender sections I fumbled in my ignorance. But with all its failings, there was community there. They didn't like people matchmaking, but I saw a Moirail matcher and went for it. Maybe I could find someone to platonically love instead of romantically. I didn't understand back then that I was asexual, and so this type of love seemed perfect for me. That Moirail thing got shut down hard, but not before someone named Kira reached out to me. It's been like a decade. We saw the fall of Homestuck together. She helped me figure myself out, and I helped her. In time, we were married. Our anniversary is April 13th. What does Homestuck mean to you?
I was in high school still when I was introduced to Homestuck by a friend of mine. It became a story I loved, and I dived into the fandom hard. I did cringy Homestuck roleplays, read tons of fanfiction, and even put together some mediocre cosplays. None of that compares to the impact the people I met, because of this fandom, had on me. A lot of friends I made during this time were confident in a way I was not, and it helped me be less ashamed of my interests. I had never cosplayed before Homestuck, and it was something I only gained the confidence to do because of the fandom. Kyle, of course, has been the most impactful and long-lasting relationship I have made because of Homestuck. I genuinely don't know who I'd be without him, and I think he can say the same.
We thought this ended years ago, but it survived. I'd forgotten far too often why I even recognize these faces that don't have names placed with them inside my hazy brain, but then there's too much to begin to touch on here. But I'm haunted by all of these memories that I have of 4 kids and a game they played together.
Thanks for watching this vat of emotions Homestuck gave me that I somehow manifested into the form of a video. If you haven't already, check out the accompanying video, the Ultimate Homestuck Recap. If you like what I've made, consider checking out my other content. I'm currently ongoing a rebranding of my channel, but you can find me under the name Kyle Marshiku. I'll be using that for my channel, where you can find a roleplay of a heavily modded Fallout New Vegas called Cinemodded Fallout, as well as streaming, something I'm considering doing in the future. That'd be fun, right? I kinda wanna do a drag thing as a sexy VTuber. I'm a Homestuck, I gotta be at least a little gay.
It's been a little bit since the last time.
Yeah, what's up, gamers? I'm Game Girl, and I'm here to show you that girls can game too. Don't go easy on me, guys, unless you want to get beat by a girl. Are you ready? Well, let's do this! Yo, I'm the Game Girl, and I got the scores, cause I whip butt and game hardcore. I might look cute, but I play to win, so get your head in the game, cause we're about to
Wait a minute. John Egbert? John Egbert? Egg?